Alright, so let's say we want to add some additional functionality to this view. Would it be nice if I could come to this view and I could choose if I wanted to delete a user? What would be an approach to doing that? Just from a UI perspective. What would you like it to look like? An X, like a button to say remove. Okay? Let's do it. So to add a button, at this point we're just talking about HTML. I'm just going to add another column. I'm actually going to also add a class called table. This comes from Bootstrap, and it just makes the table look a lot prettier. So that was just a single class up here at the top that changed it from not so fun to looking a little better. Alright, so I'm going to add another TD down here, because this is going to be a per row item. And what I'm going to do here is, how do we want to do this? The right way. I like it. Alright, so I'm going to make this a fancy looking button. So ahref, and we'll come back to that in a second. And then I'm going to go span class glyph icon remove, and I'm going to say delete. And then class btn danger, btn sm. Now, is any of that important to doing the MVC part? No. That's just to make a pretty button show up on the screen. So, I haven't actually done any work at this point. I'm just making it look cool. So if I flip back and I refresh, aw, I broke it. What'd I do? Oh, yeah. There we go. You said do it the right way.
So I'm not the one writing the code.
That's right. So there's our delete buttons. Okay? But they still don't do anything. We click on them, they don't do anything. So, what we have to do is we have to generate a post back, but maybe we don't want to actually put a form tag around each one of these, right? That's a little redundant. But what we can do is we can make a link that is a unique link that calls the delete action. Now, we don't have a delete action, we'll have to build one. But the goal here is that we can click delete and then the delete will occur. So just to give you some context, I'm flipping back to my user manager controller. And public action result, delete, int, and we'll just say ID. And that will be our user ID. All right. And then for here, we'll return content, deleting user ID. Overly simplified. And we would add our database work in here to actually delete the user. All right, so now we have this thing to call to at least. We've kind of stubbed it out. So in our href, we've used HTML helpers. There are also URL helpers. Those look like this. And we have a series of methods that we can use just like our HTML helper. The one that is of most interest most of the time is the action. And the reason action is important is because it takes a series of parameters. the two that I have the most interest in are action name and controller name. And what this does for us is it will generate the URL that's needed to call any one of our actions/controllers without us having to hard code it. It's so helpful that it will actually figure out the relative URL based on the current page's location. So it will know if it's calling, if the action being called is within the context of the current controller. So basically if index is calling delete, it knows how to render that versus calling to another controller's action somewhere else. And it deduces where it is and where it needs to go based on that data. We'll get into this thing called areas later, which is basically another layer of separation that you can build into your app. And that's when it gets real interesting, is because you can actually have actions occurring on controllers in other areas of the site, and it knows how to do the routing. It's fun. And then we get into dynamic routes, where we actually create our own routes, like /login without doing /account/login. And even though you called the account login, it uses the routing system to know that you're calling /login instead of /account/login. Good stuff. All right. So I digress. And what we need to call here is delete on user manager. Close parenthesis. So now we're calling delete, but what are we deleting? We have to tell the action what we're deleting so that it knows how to generate the URL. Because if we look at the URL now, and I know it's hard to see, but in the lower right-hand or left-hand corner of the screen, it says localhost/1908/user-manager/delete. I guess I could do this as well. It'd make it a little easier to see. In this case, it's the relative URL /user-manager/delete. What we have to do is we have to also include that ID value. So where would we get the ID value from? That's the question I'm posing to you. What?
Add user.
Okay.
But I don't think we add it, so wouldn't we have to go back and change the user view model, user manager view model, and make an ID field there and then use the ID?
Yes. Now, here's a little trick within Visual Studio. If you find a class that you need to modify, what do you guys normally do? You go to solutions, you go find it, da 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 da. If you have an instance of that class on your screen somewhere, you click on it. And then you hit F12, and it'll jump you to that class. If you're on a Mac and you're in a VM, hit function F12 if you don't have that set correctly. So that brings you into the class itself. So from here, prop int ID. Done. What's missing?
We have to do it in where you build the single statements.
In the controller. Oh, and here's another one. Control, comma, brings up this little micro search. And then you can type in the name of your class that you're looking for instead of going back to the Solution Explorer and searching for it. It's actually even smart enough where I can say index, and there's a lot of indexes, right? And then I can say user manager. And it brings me up to the view from the user manager that is the index.cshtml. I can go the other way, and that brings me the view. If I go user manager index, oh, it still brings me the view. All right. So in here, I have to say ID equals x.id, mapping that ID value from the database into my view model. There's a really sweet little library out there that works really well for these things is called AutoMapper. For these like onesie, I need to map from this from this object to this object type thing, it works really well. Basically, I say I have a new user manager. Take my user DTO and make me a new user manager, and it'll find all the properties that match, and it'll automatically copy the values over. So in our case, we would have just added that property, and then the AutoMapper would have known that we added the ID property to our view model, and it would have just started copying the DTO value for us. We never have to go back and make this change. I've used it fairly extensively on one of my projects. It also allows you to do custom mappings and things like that, and at that point, you may as well just code them by hand, because then they become a pain in the butt to manage. So, AutoMapper. All right, so we have that. So from here, you're saying pass the ID. All right. All right. So to do that, we have to set up what are called our route values. Our route values are pieces of data that we want to pass to a given action. What?
He's done all this. He's making fun of me because I did it right. This is co-op, so I'm doing shit.
So with the route values, you actually have to establish what these values are. So basically, any parameter that you could pass into your action, any value that you typically expect to get from your model binding, you can treat that as a route value. And they're handled typically by using the anonymous types. So here you say new curly bracket ID equals user.id. Yeah, I'm going to leave that. I'll show you something else in just a minute. So we'll go with that. So save that. We have to rebuild because we actually made source code changes to our C# files. And then we don't need that anymore. So if I refresh now, now it does user manager /delete/1. If I cruise down further, you'll see user manager /delete/2 all the way down to 4. All right, Mr. Co-op, why is it /4?
Because that's the ID that I put in.
Okay. Do you know why it's on a /4?
Oh, well, yeah, because if you go in the route config, it's configured so that it's controller, then view, then ID.
Right. Controller action. And then ID. Yes. Good. We'll cover that later. But essentially what's happening is that ID is considered a keyword, and there's a specialized route that's set up where it is controller/action, like we talked about before, and then if another value exists after the action, so if it's action/something, it's assumed that that is going to be mapped to an ID parameter for your action. So because because this is called ID, it becomes a slash. If I changed it from ID to, say, user ID, I would then have to jump back here and change this to, say, user ID. Rebuild. and then refresh. And if I inspect it now, it's now user manager / delete / or question mark user ID equals and then the ID value of 4. So what's happening here is it now took it from being a route value to a query string value. Now I could, if I were to hand code this, I could put question mark ID equals 4, and that would work if the parameter name was ID. But because of the way the routes are set up, there's a specialized route that's designed for ID parameters. And that's what the URL helper kind of does for you, is it determines if there's route values and then just adjusts them appropriately. So now on the flip side of that, what I wanted to show you is that we could actually forego the ID piece and just say user.id. And what happens with our anonymous type is if we don't explicitly say what the property name is, ID, it infers it, which I think is pretty cool, from the property that that's being passed in. So because this user.id is ID, the property of the anonymous type becomes ID as well. So it actually uses that text as the name of the property. So if that blew your mind, ignore what I said and keep putting ID equals.
So I mean, if you named it like, if you named the controller, if you named like ent spaghetti or something,
Yeah,
it wouldn't work.
correct. They would pass ID to it, and then I don't. My gut is yes, it won't work, but there's some weird things the model binder does, and I'm thinking it just might work. So if you want, we can test it. But let me kind of finish proving my point here. Let me rebuild and refresh. So there's ID. It's just one now. So if we flip back here and we call it spaghetti, refactor. So this is still 1, but the real question is if I click on delete. Okay, that's what I thought. It should blow up. I think it's when you get into real models that it starts to do some interesting things. So it's saying the parameters dictionary contains a null entry for the parameter spaghetti of a non-nullable type. So it's actually looking for those names. So yes, it needs it